Hello, this is the introductory video for Wednesday night worship at St John's on the 1st of July. And just before I get into our passage for this evening, I want to mention that there's just a possibility that this may be the last of these recordings that we do, depending partly on any feedback that we get back, because there's a chance we'll hopefully discuss it a bit more tonight and at other opportunities. But we could potentially start meeting back in the church building at St John's from next Wednesday for Wednesday night worship. And if that does happen, we're not sure yet whether to continue with this pattern of having an introduction recorded in advance, or whether just to look at the passage together in the church as we used to. So if you have any opinions on that, do get back to me, and I'll put a slide up at the end that has my contact details on. I'm never sure as we put this video, or one of us puts a video out each week on YouTube, whether anybody is watching it other than the small group of us that meet via Zoom on a Wednesday night for discussion and prayer. So whether you are one of that small number, or whether you're somebody else who's watching these and perhaps finding them helpful, do perhaps get back and let us know as we make a decision whether to continue with this. So just as I turn now to the passage for tonight, which is from Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 9, an apology that it's going to be out later than it has been. So I'm sorry if you were looking for it on Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning, it won't have been there. And that's because actually when I first read this passage, I was struggling to find something relevant to say that I felt was worth saying. And it's just, to me, been a reminder, and I'd like to pass this on to you, that sometimes it's worth staying with a passage, because I come to you, as I record it now on Wednesday morning, full of excitement for things that I've found as I've dug into this passage, as I've spent time, as I've worked with it, as I've prayed for God to show me something new from it. And I've got lots of things now, probably too many things, but we'll see how we go to share as we look at this short passage together. So Acts 17, I'll just read it first. So the they that it's talking about are Paul and Silas, who've been in prison. We were looking at that story over the last 2 weeks of how they were in prison in Philippi, and having been released and said farewell to the new church that they've just planted in Philippi. We read this, that when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and not a few prominent women. But the Jews were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who've caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they put Jason and the others on bail and let them go. So there's all sorts of I did get from this passage on a first reading. One of the things is well, I started off wondering why they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, but I'll come back to that, and why they went to Thessalonica. But what struck me was that there was a real contrast, and it's actually a contrast that becomes a pattern, I think, through the book of Acts as we read of Paul's journeys. The contrast in the reaction when the gospel is preached, that there is a response on the one hand of conviction and conversion, of people who are persuaded by the message. And we see that, don't we, in the first half of the passage in verses 2 to 4. As Paul takes time to reason with those in the synagogue. So both Jews we find, and also, as in Philippi, God-fearers, so Gentiles who had come to worship God as proclaimed within the Jewish faith. So he took time to reason, to explain from the scriptures, to prove that the Christ had to suffer and to proclaim Jesus. And it says that some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. And so there was this turning to God. It mentions there three Sabbath days, 3 Saturdays. So in a sense, that's only a period of 2 weeks, isn't it? And then from verse 5 onwards, we find a very different reaction. We find the opposition. And we get both. As I say, it becomes quite a pattern in Paul's ministry that there is, on the one hand, as conviction and conversion, but on the other hand, violent opposition and persecution. And so what a contrast from that reasoned debate in the synagogue to then, as we go on, some of the Jews were jealous. And so what do? They round up a mob and they start a riot, and they rush and when they can't find Paul and Silas, they drag out Jason instead, whose house it would appear they'd been meeting in, and start shouting and interesting, the accusations, isn't it? That's the other thing that struck me on first reading. Quite a backhanded compliment in a way in verse 6, that these men have caused trouble all over the world. That's quite a thing to be said of them, over the known world, I suppose, over the Roman Empire. But they hadn't reached everywhere yet, but that was the impression. But it's interesting how what they say is kind of part truth, isn't it? Or largely truth, but twisted against them, saying there is another king, one called Jesus. And that is what they were saying. There is another king, a king of kings, Jesus. And to some extent that was against what's the Roman Caesars, the Roman emperors wanted. They wanted to be thought as the divine ruler. They actually made some claims of divinity. So in some ways they were acting against that wish, though in other ways, of course, they were teaching people that they should live as respectable citizens. So it's funny how the truth gets twisted. But we've got this contrast, haven't we, of those who are converted and those who oppose. But I struggle with this passage, and the reason I think it took me a while to get into it was the fact that I thought, so why don't we see that? Why, when we preach Jesus, sort of now in Leyland at St. John's, or maybe more widely in Britain today, why don't we see either, on the one hand, a real turning to Christ with conviction, and it made me question, and it's perhaps something you might like to ponder and question, is it that we're not bold enough in proclaiming Jesus as Paul and Silas did? That there isn't this conviction and conversion of people coming to a firm faith in Christ. But the other thing we may be quite glad we don't have, and yet it's interesting that they always come together, that when Jesus was proclaimed, there was also violent opposition. And I don't feel like we really get that, not in terms of people causing a riot and telling us we're turning the world around or causing trouble everywhere. But again, is that something about us not being bold enough in our witness, or just the stage that we're at? Well, maybe a bit of both. And I want to say that I think it is worth looking at some of Paul's pioneering framework, and there are things I think we can learn from that as God calls us into perhaps situations of pioneering with the gospel. But the thing that in a way gave me a clue was actually just almost something that isn't mentioned, or something that's very subtle behind the lines that was mentioned in one of earlier looking in Acts 16. And that's the fact that we notice in Acts 16 that Luke had joined the party by the very subtle fact that the narrative changes in Acts 16 from talking about they to talking about us. So back in chapter 16, verse 16 in Philippi, we read, once when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl. Luke was with them, Luke who wrote the book of Acts. And yet by the end of chapter 16, it's Paul and Silas alone that were in prison, and it's Paul and Silas who then move on. I'm not quite sure whether Timothy was with them at this stage. He pops up again later in Acts 17 in Berea. So whether he was a bit later leaving, I'm not sure. But Luke himself doesn't appear to join the party again until several chapters later in Acts chapter 20. So it's they all the way through. We go back to third person narrative. They did this, they did that, Paul and Silas, sometimes Timothy, until, interestingly, in Acts 20, they're visiting Philippi again and encouraging some of the believers there. Just need to check the verse. Verses 5 and 6 of Acts chapter 20. He talks about some other people who were partners with Paul, and these men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. But we sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others. And then it goes back to being we again. So Paul's rejoined them. Sorry, not Paul, Luke has rejoined Paul and the others. And that got me thinking, so it's interesting, people think that Luke may well have come from Philippi. That was probably his home city. So having joined Paul and Silas in Troas and travelled with them to Philippi and been part of the mission there, he stayed on. And it struck me that there's different phases, aren't there, in God's work and in the mission of the church. There is this exciting pioneering phase, which is what Acts is really telling us about, how the gospel came for the first time to these different cities and these different places. And that was what Paul was called to do, to be a pioneer, taking the gospel to new places. But there's also the pressing on phase, or the plodding on, I've written, because sometimes it feels a bit like plodding, the persevering phase. And actually you get more of that from Paul's letters. And the other place that I found real encouragement in looking at Acts 17 was remembering that, yes, this is Paul planting the church for the first time in Thessalonica, but he continued to encourage that church after he'd moved on by writing to them, as he did to the Philippians, as he did to so many of the other churches that he planted and that make up much of the rest of our New Testament. So it was as I read Paul's letters to the Thessalonians and read about this visit from the perspective of what Paul writes in Thessalonians, that it gave me much more of a handle. And it's a good tip, actually, when you're reading Acts, to look at the letters that kind of link in with that. And as I say, it struck me that maybe sometimes the reason we don't see quite such dramatic results in terms of either conversion or persecution is perhaps that we're not always in that pioneering phase of ministry, and sometimes in the plodding on, the pressing on, the persevering stage of Christian life. It's more about the living. So let me just read you a few verses from 1 Thessalonians. I'm going to refer to various little bits from 1 Thessalonians that I found helpful. But this is where my notes may not be as good as they should be. But there is a little bit, chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about the need to show brotherly love more and more. And then verse 11, he says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business and to work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. And I haven't really explained where that links in with the fact that Luke stayed behind in Philippi. But I suppose it's the idea that once people have come to faith, that is very exciting. But actually, there's no great value in people making a decision to follow Christ if they then drop away. And one thing that comes across again and again in Thessalonians is how thrilled Paul is that the Thessalonians, having come to Christ through this initial proclamation, then persevere. They carry on living the way they've been taught. They carry on trusting Jesus even when life's tough. They keep on keeping on. And I think that's partly why Luke stayed behind in Philippi. There's this new church with Lydia and her household, and with the jailer and his household, and possibly the slave girl and maybe others. of new people who've just come to faith, and very different people, very different backgrounds. And maybe Luke, as somebody from that city, was able to stay on, I like to think, and probably work as a doctor perhaps, if that was his role. But maybe I'd like to think that he was also helping and encouraging that church to become established. Just as at a later stage, we read in Thessalonians that Paul sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to see how they're getting on and to encourage them. And that sometimes if we're not getting the dramatic things that are going on, there's still that call to perseverance, to carrying on in where we've started. But I'm going to see if I can share a few things with you now in terms of this pioneering strategy, because I think there's also lots to learn from the pioneering stage. For two reasons. One is that there's times when God will call us to pioneer, even within Leyland, to work in new areas. And there's things we can learn about that. But also because, as we work through this pattern, we'll find that the last thing about this pattern is that Paul needed the support of others in partnership with him, particularly in prayer. And that's something that's excited me, because there's been a few of us from the PCC at St John's who've been looking at developing more of a focused mission strategy in terms of how we can partner with those who are pioneering the gospel in places where there isn't as yet no national church, or no national, where people haven't yet heard about Jesus. And so many of us know about Lydia, who's working in Africa with people who've not yet heard of Jesus, and she needs prayer support, and she may be one of those that we end up linking with more intentionally. And then we're exploring the possibility of another family in East Asia who are just starting out in preparing for a pioneer role, and the possibility of being able to pray for them. And I got quite excited that as we learn about Paul's strategy and Paul's needs in this pioneering work, that can be something that we can be sharing with. As I say, we can learn for it perhaps in terms of pioneering and reaching out more with the gospel here in Leyland, but also in terms of how we can partner with and support others who are doing that pioneering work in other parts of the world. So let's see if it'll let me move on. I always have this problem. A pioneering pattern. So I've got 4 points for us that I found from here. The first thing was about the strategic starting point. So I mentioned before, right at the start of Acts 17, that he passes through Amphipolis and Apollonia and comes to Thessalonica. And it doesn't tell us why, but from what we know of Paul's travels earlier, I'm sure there was a lot of prayer and consideration as to where he should stop next after Philippi. So apparently he was travelling along an east-west trade route, and Thessalonica was about 100 miles on from Philippi, and you pass through these other two cities, Amphipolis and Apollonia, on the way. But he didn't stop there, he stopped at Thessalonica. Thessalonica was the capital of that province of Macedonia. It was a port city, so with lots of trade coming in and out by sea, but it was also central on this east-west trade route. And so it was a real hub of commerce and of cultures and of people coming and going, and a capital city. And there was also a Jewish community there with a synagogue. And so there seems to be lots of reasons why Paul will have been guided with prayer to think of this as a strategic base. And it's interesting that, as was his custom, he starts in the synagogue. So in other words, he starts his pioneering ministry with those who were already believers in God, to those who are already kind of familiar with the Old Testament, and that's his starting point. He may well have stayed on longer than Acts implies. People reckon that looking at the letters to the Thessalonians implies that there's actually probably quite a time gap between verse 4 and verse 5. So he starts off in the synagogue, and then as opposition grows from some of the Jews in the synagogue, he may well have moved to Jason's house, which is where the riot starts off from in verse 5. But he may well have been there for several weeks, possibly even months in between, teaching these people. But it's interesting that that's where he starts. So that's something to reflect on. And what's he doing as he starts off in the synagogue, and then presumably also if he then taught somewhere else? He's proclaiming Jesus with persuasion and with power. So what am I getting that from? Well, the persuasion are all those verbs that I mentioned before in verses 2 to 4 of how he took time explaining the scriptures. So there's the kind of human element, I suppose, if you like, of argument, of taking time to teach, to persuade. But the power thing is something I picked up from looking at Thessalonians, and it's a reminder of how important prayer is in this kind of ministry, and why gospel pioneers need those who will partner with them in prayer. And again, let me just refer to my notes where I've scribbled down where I got this from. It's right at the beginning of 1 Thessalonians, verses 4 and 5, where Paul writes to them, "We know, brothers, loved by God, he's chosen you because our gospel came to you not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit, and with deep conviction." And so it's just that reminder, isn't it, that there's always two parts to people being brought to faith. We need to say something, that there's a need for Jesus to be proclaimed. There's a need for us to take time and effort to explain from the Bible who Jesus is and why he came and what he means to us. But there's also a need, isn't there, for that work of God's Spirit, without which it's just words. And even if people are convinced in their heads, if it's going to reach their hearts, then there needs to be that prayer for the Holy Spirit to move with power. So that's that bit of the strategy. And then in terms of the next stage, the thing that really struck me about this Acts 17 passage is the persecution. So again, just staying in 1 Thessalonians for a minute, if we move on to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Oh, was it 3 verse 4? Yes, sorry, 2 verse 2. Where Paul writes, "We had previously suffered and been insulted in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of God, we dared to tell you his gospel in spite of strong opposition." So that's Paul looking back and reflecting on the time in Thessalonica. And it, to start with, I was thinking, wow, they've just been put in jail in Philippi. And it seems that right from the start in Thessalonica, they were aware of strong opposition from some of the Jewish leaders there. So just as Jesus had all this opposition from the Jewish leadership, so Paul begins to experience this in place after place. But he wasn't put off by that, nor was he put off by the fact that in sharing the gospel with people, they were then going to be affected by it as well. And so, it really struck me that when they come looking for Paul and Silas and they don't find him, it's these new believers that come across, isn't it? They drag Jason and they drag some of the other new Christians out and haul them before the magistrates and accuse them. And apparently that word that sort of says they in verse 9 that they put them on bail, another translation suggested they took money as security. And it's possibly that actually what they were doing there was fining them, but also making them sign up to some kind of agreement where they said that Paul and Silas were going to be banned from the city. And people think that, commentators have suggested that possibly that's why Paul wasn't able to return for a long while, because he was actually in some way had a legal ban put on him. But it made me think, gosh, would that hold us back from sharing the gospel if by doing so we knew that those that we were witnessing to, if they did put their faith in Jesus, might come up against real persecution, just as we hear of happening in so many places in the world today, where Christians are, may well get fines, harassment from authorities, prison, because of their faith. Is it, you have to really know that it's worth it to be able to pass on that message. But as I read in Thessalonians, I realized that it wasn't just that he wasn't put off by persecution, he was prepared for persecution. And in what he taught the new believers, they were prepared for persecution too. So 1 Thessalonians 3, we read of how Paul's obviously now in trouble in another place, and he says how he sent Timothy so that no one will be unsettled by these trials. 1 Thessalonians 3:3, you know quite well that we were destined for them. In fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted. And it turned out that way, as you well know. So it wasn't that, Paul took a risk hoping that persecution wouldn't come, hoping they'd get away with it. It was that he went ahead and proclaimed the gospel, knowing that it would lead to persecution, knowing that it would lead to trials and suffering and difficulty, but knowing that it was worth it. And one of the other verses that really struck me in Thessalonians was, if I can find it, 2 verse 2. No, we've looked at that already. We'd previously suffered. 1 verse 6, where we read of the reaction of the Thessalonians. Yeah, so we looked before at verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5 of 1 Thessalonians. Our gospel came not simply with words, but also with power. You became imitators of us, verse 6, and of the Lord. In spite of severe suffering, you welcomed the message with the joy given by the Holy Spirit. And again, that's just that reminder that when there is a genuine work of God, yes, it often does lead to increased difficulty, persecution, whether that's direct persecution or whether that's troubles of other kinds that we often find when people really take steps forward with Jesus, then often there can be other problems that come in, whether it's through ill health, whether it's through family problems, whether through other things. But the devil has all sorts of ways of trying to oppose what God is doing. But when it's a genuine work of God's Spirit, then even in the midst of such sufferings, there is a real joy. And that's the joy that the Thessalonians experience. As you read on through Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, you get this wonderful picture of a church birthed in the midst of opposition and persecution, and yet filled with the joy of the Spirit. And then the final thing, as I mentioned before from these letters, was that you get this idea of the ongoing partnership. So there's the initial work, but then as Paul moves on to carry on this pioneering pattern in other places, he relies on those who've already come to faith to be partnering with him. They stay there to carry on with the pressing on stage, the pressing on phase of Christian life. But he covets their prayers. And so at the end of his second letter, actually, to the Thessalonians, and I better finish now, haven't I, with this? There's so much more I could have shared. If you've got time to read through Thessalonians at some point, having looked at this passage from Acts 17, I'd encourage you to do it. But I'm just going to read a few verses now from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 to finish, where Paul writes this: Finally, brothers, pray for us, that the message of the Lord may spread rapidly and be honoured, just as it was with you. And pray that we may be delivered from wicked and evil men, for not everyone has faith. But the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen and protect you from the evil one. We have confidence in the Lord that you're doing well, that you are doing and will continue to do the things we command. May the Lord direct your hearts into God's love and Christ's perseverance. Like I say, just this wonderful picture of this partnership that now develops between Paul the pioneer moving on to new places and this new Thessalonian church who continue to persevere in their faith, whatever trials come, whatever opposition comes, and continue in prayer for Paul, just as Paul continues in prayer for them. So like I say, it just struck me that there is, I think, as we dig into this passage and into the letters that give us more of an insight into the church there, so much that we can learn. And hopefully from that, there'll be things that we can discuss and pray over to via Zoom tonight. And just a reminder again that if you've any thoughts on whether these videos are helpful and whether you'd like them to continue, then do get in touch with me. And my email address is there to do that. And if you're able to join us by Zoom tonight, I'll see you then.